Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has warned the US Congress of the threat from China. Hours before the US, Japan and the Philippines begin their first joint security summit in Washington, Mr. Kishida told US lawmakers that Beijing presents the biggest threat to the peace and stability of the international community. He's the first Japanese leader for 9 years to address both houses of Congress, and he praised American leadership on the world stage.
The United States policy was based on the premise that humanity does not want to live oppressed by an authoritarian state where you were tracked and surveilled and denied from expressing what is in your heart and on your mind. You believe that freedom is the oxygen of humanity. The world needs the United States to continue playing this pivotal role in the affairs of nations.
Well, our correspondent Janelle Dumalaon in Washington told me how Mr. Kishida's speech had been received.
Well, it would have been apparent to anyone listening just how much of an effort Kishida made to emphasize like-mindedness, to emphasize the Japanese connection to the United States. He spoke in English. That's not something that he always does. He called the U.S. and Japan shipmates on the boat of democracy. But really, his main message to U.S. lawmakers was the U.S. is not alone, meaning if the U.S. does not leave Japan to stand up to China alone in the Indo-Pacific, then Japan will not also leave the U.S. alone on the global stage to act as the world policeman. This is, of course, happening against the backdrop of growing skepticism, especially among U.S. House Republicans, about the U.S.'s role in the world, about the U.S.'s support for foreign wars, for support for its allies embroiled in foreign wars. And what the exhortation from Kishida here is that they should not give up on U.S. leadership, and if they don't, Japan will be there to help. Now, to be fair, Japan really has been putting its money where its mouth is. It's enacted several key policy changes in the last years that really did allow it to become a better defense partner, like lifting some of the curbs on its defense exports, like increasing its defense spending to record levels. Now, it's also worth noting, of course, that Japan is the biggest supporter of Ukraine in Asia. It stood by Western countries since day one as they enacted sanctions against Russia for its aggression against Ukraine. And there's this phrase that Kishida has been repeating on his visit here. It's today Ukraine, tomorrow East Asia. And in that, you can really read his motivation as he urges the U.S. not to give up on its alliances.
Garrett Exner is an adjunct fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he writes and comments on U.S. national defense. He's also been a counter-terrorism policy advisor in the U.S. Defense Department and a special operations officer in the U.S. Marine Corps. That's a life well lived. Well done. Welcome to DW. Today, President Biden and Mr. Kishida announced plans for closer and easier military cooperation. What do you think that's likely to look like?
Well, I think there's a lot of areas for growth in the U.S.-Japan alliance. Japan has a lot of room to grow their military, their self-defense forces, and take a larger role in that region of the world. They are and appearing to be our best ally in countering China, as Chinese maritime militia seem to go around and move into territorial waters of other nations in that area. Japan stands ready, and as the Prime Minister said today, they are standing ready to engage if the U.S. would just back them in that effort, and I think we should.
Right. And China clearly sees these closer ties as a threat. Just explain to us why.
Well, it's in China's interest. They said, we don't want to see this in a Cold War mentality. But of course they don't, because they've made a lot of gains over the last several decades with everybody kind of standing on the sidelines and watching. If there's a Cold War mentality that returns to where the world wakes up and sees China for the threat that it poses, then they stand a much riskier chance when they go after Taiwan. They want to increase their sphere of influence. And just like Russia wants to in Europe, But it looks to the West to see how we're going to respond with each encroachment. I think the thing that we've learned, and Russia is the perfect example of this, is that constant capitulation, regular appeasement of them grabbing territory from those who are around them, even if it's territorial waters or fishing rights in territorial waters, it matters. And the more you capitulate, the more you encourage that aggressive behavior.
But the US has viewed China as a threat for years. Why is it only now building up these alliances? And why is Japan only now saying, yes, we're ready to do this?
Well, I think the threat has gotten much more grave over the last 10 to 20 years. We now are operating in what many folks call the Davidson window, which is basically the timeline before China makes a move on Taiwan. We've realized with semiconductor production that Taiwan is critical to the international market. We've also realized that international trade and freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas relies heavily on the ability for ships to transit up and down within that first island chain, which Taiwan is the linchpin of. Now that China has built up in the South China Sea uninhibited, they've moved into other areas. They're looking to take the Senkakus. They're in constant disputes with the nations around them. It's looking a lot more, and several folks have written about this, like the actions of Germany in the 1920s and early 1930s, just moving into territories around. And unfortunately, at some point, someone has to stand up and tell them no.
OK, but is it no this far and no further, or is it no and go back?
I think it'd be unrealistic to say go back, but particularly for the Philippines, I think their interest in the meeting today was to say this far and no further. They've lost so much of their fishing waters. Their Coast Guard the Coast Guard vessels are regularly under attack from the Chinese maritime militia, and they're saying stop. This is enough, and go back. I think for Japan, similarly, they would say this and no further. They don't want to get into conflict over the Senkaku, and Taiwan, of course, would say no further. They don't want any Chinese influence in Taiwan going forward. So I think everyone would say, keep what you have. If you're okay with that, then the world should be at peace. China clearly is not okay with what they have. They want much, much more, and we're standing in their way.
OK, but it's not all peace and harmony, though, is it, between Japan and the United States? There are differences between these two partners. Talk to us about the proposed purchase of US steel by Japan's largest steelmaker, which has been criticised not just by President Biden, but also by President Trump in the past.
Yeah, this is a thorny issue in domestic politics in the United States, as trade is around the world, as with the rise of populism. I think there's a lot of steel manufacturers in the United States who are weary about a deal. They're very cautious to get into a deal with an international company and let that company purchase American steel manufacturing. They've seen this happen before in the 80s when steel manufacturing moved out of the United States. That's not to say that free trade is bad. It's not to say that agreements on steel are bad in nature, but you need to be very cautious. And I think Japan is more than willing. They see a benefit to tying their economy to ours. It protects them in the event of more Chinese aggression. But I think when you talk about workers in Northwest Indiana, they want to be sure that their jobs are going to be maintained, that they're not going to be shipped overseas to produce steel somewhere else. And that's the details of this deal that I think a lot of folks, particularly in the U.S. Senate, have issues with. They don't trust President Biden to have their best interests, the interests of Ohio and Indiana and other states like it, at the forefront.
Which brings us neatly to elections this year in the US and Fumio Kishida's position at home looking shaky. How durable do you think this initiative is likely to be?
Well, trade is always going to cause problems in election cycles. I think we saw that in Taiwan last year, right? Prime Minister or President Tsai made a deal about U.S. pork and U.S. beef that cost her party in the elections going forward. So I think if we look at the elections in South Korea as well, you'd see that there's a chance that moving forward and moving too aggressively on foreign policy issues and not giving enough attention to domestic issues can cost part of the ruling party in elections. I think President Biden, as much as I'd like him to be more aggressive on foreign policy, I think he risks a similar thing here in the States. If he's too focused on foreign policy and not focused on the issues of his voters, then it might cost him at the ballot box come this November.
Good talking to you. Thank you for walking us through that. Garrett Exner from the Hudson Institute. Thank you.